Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Farm Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Mr. Aaron Friedman, and we'll be discussing a relatively new sefer that he published or helped to publish, titled Sefer Pnei Avraham, which is Chidushim Ubiyurim Pilpulim. As I'm reading for the Sharbel, Dafal Masechta Pesachim Gittin B'Metzias, so three Masechtas of Avraham Avli Seelendfreund, who was the Av Bezdin in Kasha, in Hungary or Slovakia in the 19th century, I believe. So thank you, Mr. Friedman, for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me and including me, and thanks for all the things that you do to spread Torah.
Okay, so let's why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Yes, well, I was born and raised in Forest Hills, Queens, in New York City. I'm the child of Holocaust survivors, which is going to come up obviously here, and a key element of the story. I went to modern Orthodox elementary school where I learned Hebrew very well, and then to Chavetz Chaim High School for 4 years. Then I spent 2 years learning full-time in Yeshivat Har Etzion in Gush in Israel, followed by 3 years at YU. And I guess at the age of 22, my formal Jewish education ended, but then I followed with 3 years at NYU Law School. I'm a real estate lawyer by profession. But I've kept up my learning, or at least tried to keep up my learning since the age of 22.
So, as I mentioned, this is a sefer, and we're going to get more into the sefer and the mechaber. But how did you come to the sefer? I don't think I mentioned it was published by Mechon Shlomo Alman for the Shalavim. So their publishing house, they publish a lot of Svarim. They used to publish in Mechon Yerushalayim, now they publish themselves. What is your connection to this sefer here?
Okay, that's a long story, and hopefully you'll bear with me. So as I said, my father was a Holocaust survivor. He grew up in the town of Kasho in Slovakia, but I think it's correct to call it Hungary too, because culturally it was part of Hungary. It was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire until World War I. So in a short version of the story, which I'll come to later, my father came upon the Ksav Yad, 448 pages, two-sided, long legal-sized pages with very narrowly written Ksav Yad of Chidushim. He came on it when he returned to his family's apartment after the Holocaust, after he had been in concentration camps, and he was liberated at the very end of the war, made his way back to Kasho, and in about July of 1945, he ended up being, unfortunately, the only person from his immediate family to survive. He went back to his family's home, and then he found the Ksav Yad there. It's a riddle to us why the Ksav Yad was there. The mechaber had no connection to us. Actually, I found a very tenuous connection to our family, but an interesting one, if we have time later on. So it has a little bit of Rechilus or Lashon Hara in it, but there's almost no connection to the mechaber. We don't know, except for the fact that he was a Rav in Kasho, and my father grew up in Kasho, as I said. And as far as Mechon Shlomo Alman, I mentioned I studied in Yeshivat Har Etzion. The years that I was there, Rabbi Yoel Katan, who runs the Mechon Shlomo Alman, was also studying there. We became friendly. I love Svarim. He certainly loves Svarim. I loved just speaking to him, and we became close friends. Back in the day, I visited his family's home in Yerushalayim. He actually was in America and stayed with us for a Shabbos. So he actually got to meet my father around 1980. So when I was looking around, once I actually was playing around with this Ksav Yad. My father had brought it. We'll talk about it in a minute. When I had the Ksav Yad to publish, I was figuring out where to publish it. And another friend of mine who had been with me at Har Etzion, Shimon Shlomo Goldschmidt, told me, "Oh, why don't you take it to the Machon?" And I said, "Well, the Machon does very high level Rishonim. They're doing the smog now. They're separating out the Rabbeinu Peretz from the smog, and they're doing the smog. And this is a 19th century obscure Hungarian Rav. Would they be interested in it?" And he said they would, and it was great. So they took it over, and they did a great job with it, of course. So that's how I got to Mechon Shlomo Alman, and the Ksav Yad. We can get into a little later about how it got to my father.
Yeah, that's what I want to pick up. We can talk about the Ksav Yad. We'll talk about the community of Kasha a little bit. But before that, your father. I mean, how old was your father when he found this? I think you mentioned he was deported to concentration camp. He came back. What's the exact story? What's your father's story in this? Because he's plays an integral role in this I should mention this sefer is 966 pages. I mean, again, three Masechtas is massive sefer. So the fact that this sefer sees a light of day is your father's chus, that this really is being published, yours and your father's. So if you could talk a little bit about your father's story and what happened here.
Absolutely. And I'll mention just you should know that the 900 pages, unlike a lot of sperm, I'd say 95% of the Sefer is the mechaber's words. There's very little in the way of footnotes. And that's because the mechaber is easy to understand. We'll come to that too. So my father, as I said, he grew up in Kasho. He actually was born in November of 1930. So if you think about it, he's probably one of the youngest people to have been deported to Auschwitz and survived. So in a little bit about the history of Slovakia, I think, is necessary. Czechoslovakia was a country that includes what's today the Czech Republic and Slovakia, and even a part of Ukraine, Western Ukraine, which the Soviets took for themselves and for Ukraine after World War II. So, for instance, Munkac, Svaljeva, these towns are today in Ukraine, but they were in Czechoslovakia before World War II. And as I said, culturally, it was a Hungarian speaking place. Before World War I, it was all part of Hungary. So my father grew up in Kasho. He was the middle child of three children. He had a brother who was about 5 years older than him, and a sister who was about 5 years younger than him. His father, that's my father's father, was the ninth child of a Rav who had been a Rav in Saran, which is a town between Kasho and Munkac. My great-grandfather, who my father was named after, was named Menashe Simcha Friedman. He also published, there was a sefer published of his drashas on the Torah, but he was a Rav in about 40 years in this town. He was a Talmud of the Yitvlev, which is the Satmar Rebbe that we all know of as the Satmar Rebbe's grandfather. That's Yehuda Teitelbaum. We wrote Shas and Shuvas Abnei Tzedek. So my great-grandfather was a Talmud of the Satmar Rebbe's grandfather. My great-uncle, my father's brother, was a Talmud of the Satmar Rebbe's father. My father's father was the youngest of 9, and unfortunately, I never really asked my father where his father learned, but I got the sense that his father was a Talmud Chacham and was very involved in kehilla stuff. His older brother was a very serious learner. He was 19 when they got to Auschwitz, and my father always told the story. You can just get the sense of how learning was so important in his family, at least to his brother. The Nazis said, you can take 2 suitcases with you to the train station. So he took one suitcase with a few clothes and food for the trip, and the other suitcase was all his kisveyad, which of course, unfortunately, got lost when they got to Auschwitz. He did not survive either. So that was the kind of family he came from. On the one hand, they were very serious, very frum, but they were also modern. My father's father had gone to gymnasium, had a degree in accounting, and worked as an accountant for the biggest grain company in Czechoslovakia, for their branch office in Kasho. So he wore a shtreimel, but only in the house. In the street, he had a suit and he wore a clipped beard. He didn't wear a bekisha. But they were kind of connected to Sanz. The Sanz, if you know the map, if you look at the map, Sanz is at the very south of Poland, near the border of Slovakia. And so the shtibel they went to was the Stravkova. He was the grandson of the Sanzer Rebbe, the son of the Shinova. So it was kind of a mix of, like he would call it a modern Hasidic family. I asked my father once, if your father would have survived, where would he have davened? And he said to me, he probably would have been in the Aguda in Borough Park. That kind of guy. All these guys who were, clean-shaven and very learned and learned in yeshivas before the war. That's probably where he would have ended up. Excuse me. So my father said. So my father told me this too. I mean, he himself, like I said, his formal Jewish education stopped at 13. I was amazed. My father told me he was only 13 and a half when he was taken away from his home and when his whole community was destroyed. So I was amazed growing up in Forest Hills at how much my father knew about Yiddishkeit, about even, how to run a Jewish home, about davening and things like that. This is an example. He only had 1 year that he was bar mitzvah before he was taken away. And even though they were Hasidim, because they were this Hungarian part of Europe, they were very strong about some Chassam Sofer Minhagim. For instance, my father was always very makpid about wearing tefillin on Chol HaMoed, and to say a bracha on them. And I remember that he told me that on the first day of Chol Hamoed, Pesach, be sure to keep your tefillin on until after the reading of the first Sefer Torah, because that's when you read Kaddish Likol B'chor and V'haya Kiviyacha, where the tefillin is mentioned. So it's the kind of thing that he only saw once. Because he only had 1 year of wearing tefillin before he was taken away. But even he knew that. He remembered all kinds of hanhagas and history of kasha. So I really learned a lot from him. And he was the kind of survivor. There were two kinds: the ones who didn't talk at all, and the ones who talked a lot. And Baruch Hashem, for us, he was somebody who really shared a lot of his experiences. And we were actually zocheh to go with him in 1998. My siblings and myself and my parents to Kasho, and to get a tour of the town with him. And in this case, most of the places that he had grown up and saw, the shtiblich and the shuls were all there, not in the same use anymore by and large, but we could get really a feel for what his life was like. So he did not learn, he didn't learn how to learn the way he could have. He told me that even though it's not just fact that he was 13 and a half years old. He said by 1938, and this is the history I didn't tell you, but it's important for the story. In 1938, the Germans broke up Czechoslovakia into constituent parts. And one part they took for themselves, the Sudetenland. Another part they made this protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. Another part they made this country called Slovakia, which did not include Kasho. And a lot of what had been Czechoslovakia, they gave to the Hungarians, who were their allies. So this was very important for the survival of Jews in Kasho, because if you know the history, when the Germans invaded Poland in 1939, it started to be terrible for all the Jews in Poland. Hungarian Jews were not touched until 1944, because they were allies of the Germans, and the Germans didn't want to arm wrestle with them about getting the Jews deported. So from 1938 until 1944, Kasho was part of Hungary. Had been returned to Hungary, which meant that the Jews who were there were immune from deportation. And a lot of Jews actually escaped from Poland to Kasho to get away from the hell that was going on in Poland. So my father got a more or less normal Jewish education till 1944, till the Germans took over the Hungarian government in March of 1944. He had a regular bar mitzvah. He said this pshetel. He went to cheder. The way it was set up there, they went to cheder in the afternoon. They had public school in the morning. They went to cheder in the afternoon. But he learned something. But what he told me was that he wasn't the best masmid. And if he didn't want to go to cheder, he could easily tell his Rebbe that there were German soldiers in the street and I couldn't go out, or Hungarian soldiers. And there was a very good excuse. So he told me that he kind of regrets that he didn't use the opportunity they did have. But even that, all he had was till 13 and a half. So even though he himself did not get the kind of Torah education that he could have got, or in retrospect wanted to get, he was very, very, worked very hard for us, for his children, me and my siblings, to go to yeshiva and to learn as much. And he always loved talking about Torah. And because, as I said, even with the little bit that he did get, he knew a lot more, I would dare to say, than a lot of our children know when they're 13 and a half. So he was able to lead a life that was kind of connected to Torah, but never to contribute at this level. But here we have this wonderful thing that and let me just explain how this happened in a little more detail, how this happened. So as I said, when the family of five was deported from Kasho in the end of June in 1944. They knew that it was going to be terrible. They didn't know where they were going to be. But they said to each other, after the war, wherever we are, we all go back to Kasho, and we'll see what we're going to do from there. So unfortunately, the day that he got there with his 9-year-old sister, he knew his sister was gone. He knew his mother wouldn't be separated from his sister. So at that point, he knew his mother and sister were gone. He was together with his brother and his father for a lot of the first few months, or a good chunk of the first 6 months or so that he was in slave labor camps. But at some point, his father got separated from him, and he was with his brother when Auschwitz was given up. When the Russians were coming closer, the Germans made all the Jews run hundreds of miles. He ended up in a place called Ebensee in Austria with his brother. His brother unfortunately died a few days after they got to Ebensee in February of 45, and then he was liberated in May. He got sick after the war and finally made his way back to Kasho in July. He's 14 and a half years old. He doesn't know if his father's alive or not. He knows the rest of his family is gone. And he goes to his apartment and it's a wreck because the non-Jews in the community had figured, the Jews must have hidden valuables, and they pulled apart the whole apartment. It was a total wreck. There were no valuables, and he didn't really have much else that he could take there. The only things he found were this 448-page manuscript and one sefer that his brother had given his father as a gift, which we still have in our library now. So he took the sefer with him. It was a very, very unsettled time, and he was a 14-year-old who had no pikuach. Nobody was watching what he was doing. He was running around smuggling cigarettes from one zone to the other, living a very, very unhealthy lifestyle for about 6 months. And the whole time he was able to keep the Ksav Yad and the sefer wherever he kept it. Eventually, he got to Northern Ireland, where the British Army was taking refugees, and then from Northern Ireland he went to London, where he lived for 3 years, learned how to cut diamonds, and ended up being in the jewelry business for his whole life. He came to the United States in 1949. So that's pretty much the story of how my father came to the Ksav Yad, and he kept it with him. He never really had the time or the budget to do anything with it while he was alive, but it was always something that was in our house when I was a child, and I take it and I try to make heads and tails. I couldn't read one word of the Ksav because it was so hard to read the handwriting. I just knew that it was called Pnei Avraham, and it was on 3 Masechtas.
So, first of all, earlier when you were saying your great-grandfather, I think, was a Rav, the audio cut out for a thing. Your great-grandfather was Rav where?
In a town called Sobrance, Sobrance, which, as I said, is about midway between Kasho and Munkac, or Kasho and Ungvar, which is like the first town over the what's today the Slovak-Ukrainian border.
So did your father ever tell you, did you ever ask him, why did he decide to take the Ksav Yad and just carry around with him all those months, all those years, and just carry and keep it with him his whole life? Did you ever get the reason out of him?
I didn't get an answer to that specific question. I think my father felt that there was some great value in it, that there's Torah here that has to be preserved. He couldn't explain who it was. At the beginning, when I was a young child, my father's brother's name was Avram Yaakov. And so first when I saw it, as a, 11-year-old, and I said, oh, maybe this was from my father's brother. Maybe he didn't take all his ksavim with him to Auschwitz. Maybe we have something that's he himself. And then later on, when I showed it to people who could read the Ksav Yad, they told me that this is just too advanced, even for a masmid who spent 5-6 years learning, to have written at the age of 19. So it was something that was Torah that even while my father wasn't necessarily involved he was not at all involved in publishing Torah Svarim, he thought it would be a great, terrible thing to just leave it there. Honestly, in retrospect, in 1998, when we did visit, we went to the shul was still functioning. There's still a few hundred Jews living in Kasho today. Then there was still a minyan Friday night, Shabbos morning, Shabbos afternoon. My father went back the first time in 1984. And there was a minyan 3 times a day still. So what happened after the war was they brought people brought all kinds of shemas and ksavim and svarim to what had been the rabbi's office or study. So in theory, he could have left it there. I think he felt that this was something that it's not b'chdi, that it's not for naught that he had it, and it's his role in life to do something with it. Unfortunately, he never really. He had a lot of things that he was involved with the cloud, but this was just something that he didn't really have, something to focus on. He did not focus on this.
So is that what pushed you to publish it and fund it and decide to go ahead with this project, the Leilui Nishmas, your father?
Very much so. Is Leilui Nishmas my father? I haven't. It's a dangerous hobby, but I started collecting svarim. Particularly, I have like little niches that I like to buy, and one of them is svarim that were printed in Slovakia and Hungary after the Holocaust. There were still 2, 3, 4 years where they were publishing lamdish svarim. There aren't that many, or like lost causes. Like I have svarim that were printed in Beirut in the 1950s, or the Soviet Union. There's a couple of svarim. I'm very happy to have one that was printed in Leningrad in 1924. And I said to myself, here I am, plunking down dollars for svarim when I have something that I'm sitting on that was never even out there, that nobody's ever seen. And so I started to figure out, what am I going to do with it? Like I said, I'm an attorney. I'm a real estate attorney. My practice is in New York and New Jersey, and real estate attorneys use title companies. So I usually use. I'm very happy with Riverside Abstract. The sales agent that I use, his name is David Bernay. I should call him Rabbi David Bernay. He's a Talmid Chacham of merit as well, and he's really into Maseches Psachim, so much so that he actually wrote a sefer on Maseches Psachim. So I mentioned him to have the Ksav Yad, and he told me that there's a gentleman who learned in Panovich for many years. His name is Moshe Heller, lives in Kiryat Sefer, who was the editor of his sefer. And I said to myself, okay, maybe I can make this work. I have children in Eretz Yisrael. I visit there a lot. Let me go meet with Moshe Heller and explain to him what I got and see if he can, help me here. So he was great. He was able to find somebody who could type up the Ksav Yad, a man named Yisrael Yosef Friedman, not related, never spoke to him. I dealt with him only through Rabbi Heller. But he gave the entire. The Ksav Yad was scanned and emailed to Israel, typed up, and then Moshe Heller put the ha'oros on it. So all of a sudden now, even though I don't really have connections in this world, I had a lot of what to go with. I had the sefer typed up with the ha'oros, and then just needed Mechon Shlomo Alman to put the thing together and do the final finish. It was many years since my father passed away in 2015. I was patching around with it for 4 or 5 years. Sometimes starts and stops, but at the end of the day, and during this time, I had some very interesting conversations, which hopefully we'll come to, about the nature of the sefer with all kinds of rabbanim. But at the end of the day, I was able to put this thing together, and it finally came out during Sviva this year, actually last year we could say. And I felt when I picked it up, I felt almost like I had a child. This was something that my father is now able to contribute to high-level Torah learning, even though, Afapi, whatever he suffered and whatever, detractions he had in his Jewish education, to be able to contribute through his efforts, which I thought was just a tremendous thing.
Yeah, really an amazing story. And, like I said before, it really is, b'schus your father and you, that we have the Sefer. And you included, in the edition, there is a Hakdama in here. You included 10 pages where you go through your father's story and you do relay this story. So for those who, we'll talk about at the end, who are interested in purchasing the Sefer and getting a copy of the Sefer, it's in there. They can see this as well. Okay, so now let's turn to the Sefer. I think you mentioned, or maybe not, is that the Ksav Yad is in a very hard to read handwriting in places, but it doesn't say, there's no Sharba, it doesn't say the name, but it does say Pnei Avraham in big black letters. And we already mentioned it's Avraham Avli Seelendfreund. First of all, how did you know that this was him? Because there was no Sharba. Then we could talk about who he was and the style of the Sefer. But how did you find out who was the mechaber?
Okay, so there are 2, 3 very eyes on their proofs, that we can say that prove he's the mechaber. First of all, the name Pnei Avraham. When I got older in YU, I studied history. I took a lot of courses in Bernard Revel. I know my way around Jewish history, and I said, there's a sefer called Pnei Avraham on Chulin, printed by a Rav in Kasho in 1878. I said, that's so, and here this is not Chulin. I mean, if it would have been Chulin, still no right, that's not him. But I said, well, in the Hakdama of the sefer, the mechaber writes that he has chidushim on many Masechtas, including Psachim, Gittin, and Baba Metzia, and that he only would like to publish them, but he doesn't have the money to do it. So that I thought was, it's not foolproof, but it's a very good proof that that this is that, especially because it was found in Kasho and has the same exact name. This is before I could read a word of the Sefer. Then reading the Sefer, and I haven't gone through the whole Sefer, I'll admit, not all 900 pages yet, but I saw in there, this is a totally Eisner proof. He wrote that this is Chidashti, and I printed this Chidush Torah in my father's Sefer, which is called the Shari Chaim, which was printed in 1860 so-and-so. So sure enough, you look up that Sefer, which was written by the father of this mechaber, and you see that in the beginning, there's a Chiddush of the son, Rav Avram Avli HaKohen Seelendfreund. So that, I think, is foolproof. One more thing that came out when the Sefer was about to go to print, I saw in one of the Jewish auction houses that they were selling a letter by this mechaber, written, it's basically a letter of a recommendation of somebody going to Eretz Yisrael. They should get into a good yeshiva, written in the 1880s. And I showed that, and there was a photocopy of the letter in the auction catalog. So I emailed that to Rabbi Heller. I said, is this the same handwriting? He said 100%. So that solved a different question. Some people told me, well, maybe he wrote it, but maybe somebody else rewrote it for him. So now we know that that's not true, that this Ksav Yad is the actual autograph of the mechaber, not just his Torah. So all that came late in the game. I would have published this even if it was on Kabbalah. It's just anything that my father saved with that kind of story. Even if I had no interest in it, I would have published it. But as we're going to see, I think that it came out that my father was able to yarshin to us something that really spoke to my heart. Without that I'm only coming to realize at this point in the game. So that to go back to your who Rabbi Seelendfreund was, I think I have to give you a little hakdama about what Pasha was, and before that, what Hungary was. So the first thing I think that your audience, I'm sure, is very well familiar with Sfarim and with the concept Hungarian, but I think I have to modify it a little because it's not always what we think it is. First of all, before 1750, let's say, there were very few Jews living in what we call Hungary. There was only a little part of Austria that's called Burgenland, which had been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was where Rabbi Akiva Eiger came from, like Eisenstadt, and then Pressburg. But besides those areas, a lot of what we call Hungary, Jews were not allowed to live there. It was only when Poland broke up as a country in the late 1700s, and it became part of, like Galicia became part of the Austro-Hungarian, it became possible for Jews to move into Hungary itself. So the kehilla in Kasha, for instance, really only started in 1840. And a lot of these kehillas were like that. Munkat, Satmar, all the places that we believe as Hungarian, Tif Ungaran, they were not Dori Doris of hundreds of years of Yishuv. It was only basically a 100-year settlement. Now, about 30 years later, when the Hungarians got more autonomy in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they started to say, let's make Seder among the Jews. We don't know what the Jews are. We don't know who we can draft to the army, who's born, who could be taxed. So we need to have kehillas. We need to have organizations so we can keep vital statistics about our Jews. And so they made the Jewish communities make official kehillas. So by this time, a lot of Western Hungary was influenced by the Reform. They had their own Hungarian version of Reform called Milag. And so when it came time for kehillas to form, lots of times the kehillas were controlled by Reform rabbis. And that got the Talmidim of Chassam Sofer, he was already gone by then, but the Talmidim of Chassam Sofer were very opposed to that. And that's where the term Orthodox really comes from. They came to the Hungarian government and they petitioned and said, we know that legally you're recognizing these kehillas. We want you to recognize a parallel kehillah. They're the Neolog and we're the Orthodox. And with a lot of lobbying, they got the government to recognize officially Orthodox kehillas. But then the next thing that happened was, and this is the late 1860s, some kehillas didn't know they were equally divided. The modern rich people wanted to be Neolog. The younger, the frummer and the less affluent people wanted to be Orthodox. And they would fight. Who owns the shul? Who owns the Beis HaChaim? Who's Shchita? And so there was a third group that came and said, we don't want this. We don't want to have fighting between the Jews. We want to be with the status quo that we were before the government started to make us declare who we were. We want to be just Jews. And whoever comes to shul, whoever doesn't. They call themselves status quo ante, which is Latin for status quo before. They wanted to be what they were, and they also petitioned the government to get recognition. So that you ended up in the bigger cities in Hungary with three kinds of kehillas: Orthodox, Neolog, and status quo. Now, the status quo they davened the way we daven. They said all the piyutim. They kept all the mitzvahs the way Orthodox Jews kept them. The only thing is that they weren't willing to declare themselves as Orthodox as opposed to anything else. But you can imagine that some of the radical Orthodox and the firmest of the rabbis were very much against the status quo, not because of what they did, but because they didn't want to take a stance against the Neolog. So this rabbi, this is also interesting for my father, this rabbi was the Rav of the status quo kehilla in Pasho, which is very interesting because usually a status quo Rav would be more modern. If he was going to write, it would be on Midrash, it would be in German or in Hungarian, or maybe in easier Hebrew. You didn't have status quo Rabbanim, with one exception, and we'll come to in a minute. You didn't have status quo Rabbanim who wrote Chidushim in Pilpul style on Masechtas. So he was, in a sense, the class by himself. I know from his history, which is nowhere to be found in his Kiddushim, that he got involved in kehilla stuff. At one point, he left Kasha for 5-6 years and then came back. So he had an interesting life as a Rav of a kehilla, but not anything that's relevant to the Sefer. So as I said, he was the status quo Rav. Where did he learn? That's, I know, a question. I've been listening to so many of your podcasts, And I know that's a question that always comes up. And you also probably know that somebody who was born in 1810, he dies around 1890, so he's really a 19th century person. He doesn't have a yeshiva to go to. If he's born in southern Poland, in Galicia, and he didn't. He learned with his father first, who wrote, as I said, a sefer called Shari Chaim. And then he learned with, which is on Maseches Beitza, and then he learned with his mother's brother, whose name was Rabbi Lezer Lev, wrote a sefer called Shemen Rokeach. Again, you can go to yeshiva for 20 years and never have heard of these svarim, and that's part of my agenda here. So Rabbi Lezer Lev was not a Katu Kani Bagman, let's say. He was not a low level Rav. To give you an example, you know that the Chassam Sofer was the son-in-law of Rabbi Akiva Eiger, but he wasn't that much different in age. They were only about a year apart in age. He was born a year later. He died a year earlier. About that. So the Chassam Sofer he was 50. He was over 50 when he married Rabbi Akiva Eiger's daughter, who was in her early 20s. So they were in effect contemporaries. And Chassam Sofer in 1815, Rabbi Akiva Eiger was a Rav. He wasn't yet in Posen. And he wanted a better stellar. He actually wanted to go to Posen. There was like a 2-year fight in Posen to get Rabbi Akiva Eiger in. So during this fight in 1815, another stellar came up in Moravia, which then had a lot more Talmidei Chachamim than in the 1900s. And this stellar came up, and it was in a place called Trest, Trest. And the Chassam Sofer was pushing for Rabbi Akiva Eiger to get it, but Rabbi Lezer Lev got the stellar. So he was chosen over Rabbi Akiva Eiger for the stellar. Eventually, he also went to Hungary, and he ended his life in Hungary. He wrote many svarim, usually with the name Shemen Rokeach. There's Shemen Rokeach on Psachim. There's Hadas and Tshuva Shemen Rokeach. And as I said, he was a parallel to Chassam Sofer, about the same age. But there was a whole group of these Rabbanim who came from Galicia who were going into the new territory of Hungary in the early 1800s. He was one of them. Chassam Sofer himself was one of them, arguably. And these were people who were parallel, but you didn't learn much about them because what happened was the Chassam Sofer's Tzadzaim, so many of them became Rabbanim in Hungary, and that eventually they kind of drowned out the whole other parallel, ma'arechet of Rabbanim that were existing. So Rabbi Lezer Lev was his Rebbe, his uncle. For a short time, it was his son-in-law, and he was his father-in-law. That he married his first cousin for a short time, and so he was basically his Rebbe Muvak. And he himself was a big Talmid Chacham. You can see it from the sefer that he wrote, which we'll talk about the Tochen soon. As I said, he published 3 svarim in his lifetime. He published one in 1865 when he was about 55, called Pras Avos. That's more like Drush. It's on Pirkei Avos, on Saba de Veyatuni, on the Agadas of Rabba Bar Bachana. But even in there, he has drushes and he has Shas and Shuvas that are pretty heavy. And then he published the Pnei Avraham, which is similar to the sefer we published, which is on Chulin. And then, very interestingly, in 1886, when he's at the end of his life, he publishes a sefer called Agra de Hespeda, and the main thing is a hesped on Moses Montefiore, who had very little to do with Hungarian Jewry, from what I understand. What prompted him to write that, I have no idea. But even in that sefer, there are a lot of Chidushei Torah and Shalos and Shuvas as well. So we have, as I said, we have a sefer here that I felt that, okay, so now it starts, we're talking like 3-4 years ago. By now already, I'm starting to get word versions of the sefer. And I look at it and I ask myself, Lemi ani yamel, who's gonna, what's the sefer about, and who's gonna want to learn it? So I'm gonna ask you.
I want to jump in for a second before we talk more about the sefer. What's interesting, you talk about the status quo, and we can talk a little more. But even though he was a status quo Rav, as you said, he's a kind of classical Hungarian style. We'll get into like style Svarim, and you mentioned he has a sefer from Pnei Avraham and Chulin. He has major haskamas there. He has haskama from the Divrei Chaim of Sanz. He has haskama from the Chedush Urim. He has haskama from I'm looking at his cousin, who I don't think you mentioned yet, Yirmiyah Lev. You should talk
Yes,
about him.
yes.
It's Hirsch Liska, he has it from Shalmei. I mean, he has the who's who of Rabbanim of Haskamas here. So we should just clarify that, and there's more Haskamas here. I think also. So I don't know if you want to talk about the Haskamas. We just wanted to make sure that we emphasize that for the listeners.
Oh yeah, so I'll tell you some more, which is interesting. He was like an everyman. Everybody liked him. When I started doing research on him, I found I was doing research on Kasho as well, and I found that there was this publication called the Zeitschrift for the Geschichte der Juden in Czechoslovakia, the history, the periodical for the history of the Jews in Czechoslovakia, which was published in Czechoslovakia in the late 1920s, early 1930s in German. And my Yiddish, I guess, was good enough for me to understand a bit of the German. And so the Neolog rabbi of Kasho in the 1930s wrote 2 articles on the history of the kehilla, which was at that time only about 90 years old. So when it came time to writing about the status quo, he was raving about Rabbi Seelendfreund. He called him a Hillelischer type. He said he was a kind of like Hillel, and he got along. He wasn't Shammai. He didn't get angry. He got along with the Neolog. He got along with the Orthodox. He was the kind of Jew that really was Noach Lamokom Labrios. And so it was funny. It's amazing to see. He had tremendous haskamas from the Gaonim of his generation, whom he met, whom he discussed. And they write in there that they discussed the Torah with him. And including, let's mention Rabbi Yirmiyah Lev as well for a moment. So Rabbi Yirmiyah Lev was the grandson of the Shemin Rokeach, or Rabbi Eliezer Lev. Rabbi Eliezer Lev's son, oldest son, was Binyamin Wolf Lev, who wrote a wonderful sefer, which again you don't know about, even if you learned in yeshiva. It's called Shari Torah, and it's basically Klalei Shas, which was a popular genre in the 19th century. So he wrote a sefer called Shari Torah, and in there he also has chidushim from his son Rabbi Yirmiyah Lev. Rabbi Yirmiyah Lev he also was an everyman in a certain sense. Rabbi Yirmiyah Lev was a staunch status quo rabbi. He was, in effect, the Gadol Hador of the status quo movement, because he was by far maybe not by far because we have our mechaber, but he was one of the greatest of their Talmidei Chachamim. And the number is a very small number of status quo rabbanim who wrote Lamda Shesvarim. We have Rabbi Yirmiyah Lev and we have our mechaber, who is again his first cousin once removed. Rabbi Yirmiyah Lev was like a lot of these people. He had the same biography. Born in Galicia, moved to Moravia, to the western parts of what was Czechoslovakia, but eventually ended up in Hungary. Now, Rabbi Yirmiyah Lev ended up in Il, which, if you know, I don't know the long Hungarian pronunciation, Sator Ujeli, Ujhely is the way you would write Il in Hungarian. Il is very famous even today, because it was the place where the Yismach Moshe, the first Satmar Rebbe, was Rav. And if you know the history, which I'll tell you in a half a minute, when the Yismach Moshe's son did not follow him at El, his father-in-law was a Rav in Poland, in Drohobych, so he went to Drohobych. But his grandson, the same Rabbi Yikusiel Yehuda Taliban, who we mentioned before, who was my great-grandfather's Rav, his grandson, so Yismach Moshe's grandson, took over in El. When he took over, the community was by far Ashkenazish. They did not want to have a Hasidic Rav. They made him sign a declaration that he won't daven this. He will only daven Nusach Ashkenaz, even if he's davening at home. He didn't live up to it, and there was a bunch of fights. Eventually, he left El for 5 years, and the community was looking for somebody who would be very staunchly in favor of Nusach Ashkenaz and all the minhagim that they thought were important. And they hired Rabbi Yirmiyah Lev because they knew he would be somebody who wouldn't take any, wouldn't allow for any inroads in for Hasidim and EOS. And in fact, that is when the Yitavle moved to Siget, and that's why the Satmar Shusheles comes from Siget and Satmar, because they left EO because Rabbi Yirmiyah Lev was on his campaign against them. So Rabbi Yirmiyah Lev is a very interesting person. But here's the irony of it. He wrote a sefer called Divrei Yirmiyahu on the first few parts of the Rambam. I think it's Mada Ava and Zmanim. Also, big lumdus, nothing there about status quo Rabbanis. And they found, like our mechaber, they found chidushim that he wrote on Maseches Kiddushin that were published, I think, by Machon Yerushalayim about 15, 20 years ago. Now, what's fascinating is who the haskamas on that sefer are. you have the Minchas Yitzhak, right, from the Eidach HaRedis, Rabbi Weiss, and you have Rabbi Brosner, who's also Hungarian, and they write about how Rabbi Yirmiyah Leib was such an opponent of the Neolog, which he was. They just leave out the part about him being a staunch status quo Rav. So there's a place, and this is one of the Rabbanim I spoke to about this mechaber. So what am I doing, putting out a sefer on the status quo Rav? And they said, gam avasam, gam sinasam, gam kinasam kvar avada. At this point, very few people know about it, although I didn't want to paper it over. So it is mentioned by Rav Yoel Katan in his hakdama to the sefer. So we're not hiding anything here. So that I think would lead me to the sefer itself.
Yeah, I think that does. Yeah, no, we definitely should discuss. I'm sure there's more to discuss. And you're giving me an education on Hungarian history and status quo history. And like you said, it is mentioned in Rabbi Katan's. He also has a short mavi. So I think I mentioned you have a mavi. Then you have your introduction mainly about your father's story and about the Ksav Yad, and then there's Rabbi Katan has a short one about the sefer and the mechaber. And there's some few haskamas that you can talk about, and then there's the haskamas of the sefer. You reprinted the haskamas that the mechaber himself got for Chulin and others, etc. But we should talk about the sefer because we've given your father's background, the mechaber's background, about the sefer.
I also don't want to leave out my children, who I'm very proud of. I also asked some of my children to write, and they also put in a few words there too. So this is my chance to give them some FaceTime in the world of Sfarim, and they did great, I think. The sefer itself was I'll start going back to my education. So my education was kind of very variegated. I mean, I went to modern Orthodox day school. I spoke Hebrew fluently when I was 13. Then I went to this. They're not as yeshivish as the other yeshivas, but Chavetz Chaim still yeshivish enough for me to have, said to myself, although they have their own shnit, their own way of learning. But I got some kind of exposure to that. And actually, my 10th grade Rebbe, I think I learned the most from in high school, was Rabbi Bosch, who's, I think, in Torah T'mima now. He was first starting out, and he was a Talmud of Aaron Cutler. And I've had a really great, introduction to a Lakewood train from the old Lakewood. So I really did have that. And I had it happens to be my mother's brother and all my first cousins are all Satmar Hasidim. Which my father, obviously get along fine with. So I kind of had this. All our closest relatives in America, who's were Satmar Hasidim, so I knew them. I knew the modern Orthodox. I was always trying to put it all together, and I was always interested in Sfarim and interested in where things come from and where people come from. And it's about my reading. I always read about, and I'm sure you have too, all the people who are against Pilpul. You read about this guy was against Pilpul, this guy's against Pilpul, and how bad Pilpul was, and but nobody really tells you two things I always wanted to know: who did write Pilpul, and what is Pilpul? Not necessarily in that order, And I kind of pushed every now and then when I came across Yad Onim, know about these things. I found that it was told to me that the Haflah is a good example. Have you heard that? A classic example of Pilpul, Haflah Ksuvos, which I found very interesting because the Chassam Sofer, I think he gets away unfairly. I don't think he was such an opponent of Pilpul. I haven't gone through a little Chassam Sofer here and there. I think there's plenty of Pilpul in the Chassam Sofer. But the Chassam Sofer was his Talmud, of course. And, I found it interesting because, the Haflah is not studied today, even though everybody knows about it. And then you get to the Pnei Yeshua, which I had an argument with one of the people who was involved in the Sefer, because I wrote in my Hakdama, I said that I know, and this was a guess that I proved true. I said, I know that today they hardly learn Pnei Yeshua, except maybe when the Ktsos quotes the Pnei Yeshua. But people don't really learn Pnei Yeshua. And then somebody said, no, that's wrong. And I said, okay, let me find out. So I asked people around the YU Farm sale, which is going on now. I said, how many Pnei Yeshuas did you sell last year? The number was very low. And then I asked somebody else I know who's a big seller of Sfarim, and he said, I sell, but it's no proof because a lot of them are bar mitzvah gifts. I too get the sense that Pnei Yeshua is not the kind of learning. There's this brisker derech. And then I was speaking to, I met a lot of Rabbanim. I was speaking to one he's a Rav of a branch of a Hasidus in Williamsburg. And he sends his kids to Satmar yeshiva, like the major Satmar yeshiva in Brooklyn. And he said to me, at every level in the Satmar yeshiva, there are two shiurim, at least in his son's yeshiva. There's a shiur given, both given by Satmar Hasidim. One is the Hungarian derech, and one is by a Satmar the Chassid who learned in Brisk, and it's the Brisker derech. And everybody is trying to get out of the Hungarian shiur and into the Brisker shiur, including my own sons. And it really bothers me. That's what he told me. So, and then I spoke to somebody else who told me, there is a sefer, which is, again, maybe we heard of it. Very few people have ever opened it, called Kikayan Deyona, that mechaber Reisman, who certainly was a product of Hungarian yeshivas, was very much proponent of. The story is that he went to England before the war to research Kistayad of the sefer. He put out a scientific edition of the sefer before the war. It was one of the first things he did when he came to America, and he established the printing press in Mount Kisco. He printed it again. And people tell me nobody looks at the Kikayan Deyona in Mount Kisco today.
I want to jump in. It's interesting. Kikayan Deyona, Rabbeinu Tumen Frankel on Shas, he was in Prague in about the 17th century. It actually was just reprinted, meaning it was printed by just a basic Yeridas Farm, which is this basic like new font. And it was out of print for a while. They just reissued it. Again, it's nothing fancy, no notes. It's not a critical edition, but it is back in print. Interestingly, I want to point out also about the Pnei Yeshua. Interestingly, I'm not going to take a stance here how much they do or don't. It is pretty learned in standard yeshivas. Is why, as far as I recall from learning in yeshiva. But another thing about selling it, I would point out, it is in the Kovitz Mefarshim.
Right. So
I think standard yeshiva guys, they have the Pnei Yeshua there. Now you want to know if it's used as much anymore as it was, and now it's the Ilam learning Rabbi Ber and Rab Chaim and Briskerov and other things. Okay, Rabbi Chanan, whatever, but to some extent. But point taken. And continue on about the Kandiyana and the Pilpul.
Yeah. I mean, you have to see. I'm sitting on the outside. I live in Teaneck. I haven't learned in yeshiva in over 40 years, and I talk to people when I know that they're learning yeshiva. I don't really know what goes on there, but I do and I don't, because I go to farm stores. I see what people buy. I see what people are learning and what they're not learning. And so I kind of make my own conclusion. My kids always make fun of my conclusions are always ill-supported, but in this case, I'm not going to give up so easily. So I always wanted to know what Pilpul was, and I said to myself, and you have a double Mayim Kenuvim Yutaku here. You have Mayim Kenuvim if you're Hungarian and you grew up learning that the status quo were really terrible. So here you have a sefer that there's nothing wrong with, but it happens to be written by a status quo Rav. So that could be somebody who would be interested in the sefer ipso facto, no matter what style it is. And then there's the political incorrectness of the sefer. That you have this sefer, and I made some statistics for the sake of this conversation, and about what his mitzvah is, or what does he have when he comes to learn Masechta, this mechaber of the Seelendfreund. How does he learn a Masechta? Like you gave a show which I listened to, found very interesting, about what we have on Pesachim, right? So when somebody comes out of yeshiva, it doesn't matter if it's YU, Brisk, or whatever they come, even Satmar, as we said, they're gonna want to know what Rishonim are there on the Masechta. But that's not the way these mechabrim, and they're very obscure mechabrim. This is in a certain the tkufa, after the Shach, before the Brisk and the Litvaks took over the whole learning industry. There was a tkufa where people wrote Pilpul Sfarim, and they really were interested in very, very few Sfarim. So, of course, you have Rashi, Tosfos, the Rambam. He could be used as a foil, and the Ravid, and then the Pnei Yeshua, of course. The Maram Shif is very big for the Pilpul world, and not very big. I don't think people are learning Maram Shif, certainly not the way they're learning Pnei Yeshua. But he's very big in this world. And then there's these kind of Sfarim that some of them I hardly heard of, and some I never heard of. So let's take our three Masechtas. Okay, Sachim, he quotes the Shem Rokeach, which is a sefer that very few people know about, which of course is his uncle and his Rebbe. He quotes him 52 times. He quotes Or Chadash, which some people heard of. Or Chadash, I once heard Hershel Schechter give a shir, and then before he quoted the Or Chadash, he said, there's this Pilpul Hungarian sefer called Or Chadash. He couldn't just say Or Chadash, because nobody in the audience, even they were Talmidei Chachamim, would have heard of the Or Chadash otherwise. But Hershel Schechter is he's one of the people who does learn these kind of sfarm. So you have the Or Chadash, who lived a generation or so before the mechaber. He quotes him 79 times. Then in Gittin, there's no Or Chodesh, there's no Shemer Rokeach. In Gittin, there's a Sefer that he quotes 188 times. And every time I met a Talmud Chacham during this project, I would ask him, have you heard of the Sefer Kedushas Yisrael? And invariably, the answer would be no. Nobody ever heard of the Sefer Kedushas Yisrael, which has a very nice comment from Sam Sofer, written again almost half a generation before this Sefer. I don't think it's been reissued. You can tell me. I know the Or Chadash, I think, has, but the Kedushas Yisrael has not been. And that is his go-to Sefer, other than, Gemara, Rashi, Tosfos, Marsha. I forgot the Marsha. Marsha, Maram Shif, and Pnei Yeshua, and then the Kedushas Yisrael. And that's the way he learned. And we'll get to, I want to go a little further in how he learned in a second, but just the Sfarim that he's quoting. So his view of what's available, what's not available is much different than almost everybody else today's view would be. And in Bava Metzia, the same thing. There he doesn't have the those farmers. He quotes the Pnei Yeshua 191 times because he doesn't have a Kedushas Yisrael, he doesn't have an Or Chadash, and there aren't that many Pilpul Sfarim, I guess, between him and those grades. So what is he doing? What is Pilpul? Well, let me give you my definition. At least you can get it out there. And I think it's it comes a little bit from the Wikipedia article in Hebrew about Pilpul, and it comes also from just having asked a lot of people what it is. So the Yal Kagam, right? Abai and Rava argue in the Yal Kagam. So Pilpul, and this is the Nod of Yehuda. This is not just somebody. This is somebody we did hear of. There's a sefer, I think it's called Borei Tzion, which is like halachic drushes. He gives you Pilpul explaining why every one of these things is one shita. If you hold like a Rava in Yud, you have to hold like him in Ayin. If you hold like him in Ayin, you have to hold like him in Lamed. So all 6 things, which we would say have nothing to do with each other, these are just simanim in the Gemara. The Pilpul will tell you things which we know. He starts from a perspective that we'll say is not true. There is no connection between all the shitas of Rava and Yal Kagam and all the shitas of Abai and Yal Kagam. But to get there, to do that, you have to be a tremendous Talmud Chacham. So when you read Pilpul, can we backtrack for a moment? Let's talk about Chumash, right? In Chumash, we have tolerance for that, right? Even the people who go to Litvish yeshivas, right? And they say, all right, if I want to know Pshat in Chumash, I'm going to learn the Malbim, or I'm going to learn Aksav HaKabbalah, or the Nitziv, right? If I want to drush on Chumash, I got the Beis Halevi, obviously from Brisk, right? If I want to drush on Chumash, I have, I don't know, you have Abbas Yonason, you have, whatever, you have Yaros Tarash, you have 100 Pilpul Sfarim on Chumash. And it doesn't matter to me if, you have Mishnah Lamelech, right? What's it called? Parashas Drachim, right? That Esav and Yaakov are arguing with the same machlokas as, right? The Shitas is another big Pilpul thing. To take A and B in one machlokas and C and D in the other one and say A has to hold like C and B has to hold like D, which we would say is not mukhrach. And that's what Pilpul is. So when it's in Chumash, we don't mind. We have tolerance for that. But when it's in Gemara, it just kind of like gets erased. There's no Svarim between the Rishonim and now, unless they're the kind of Svarim that write the way the Rishonim do. So when it comes to Pilpul Svarim, they have the same tolerance for learning Gemara that way that we have for learning Chumash that way. So why would you want to learn the Mishnah Lamelech, the Parashas Drachim? Not because you believe Yaakov and Esav, they really argue this way, but the lumdus in there, the ideas that you can get, the whole structure is itself intellectually stimulating. You get a feel for what learning was like, and you learn a lot on the way. It's an intellectual workout, so to speak. So what I think this sefer does is exactly that. The chidushim that are there are not the kind of chidushim that you'll find in the Granat, or the Shiurim of Shlomo Hyman, or Nachum, or whatever else they're putting out today, and they're not conceptual, and they're based on these kind of usually it starts with a Tosfos says this kasha, ignore Tosfos Terah. That joke. Why does Bereshit start with an aleph? What's the answer? You tell me it doesn't, right? Right?
Exactly.
That's one teretz. That's the So I would say different teretz. So it's the same thing. You're starting with, Tosus asks the question. Tosus gives a good teretz. Ignore Tosus teretz, and you spend 2 pages showing me these 2 shitas before we get to Tosus. Let's understand what Rabbi and Rabbi are arguing about. It's the same as Rabbi and Yosef and this other Masechta. And now that we answered that, we can go back to Tosus' question, and we can answer the Tosus question this way. So you're getting an intellectual workout. You have to know a lot of other sugyas, a lot of other, a lot of other shitas. And you may or may not agree with it, but at the end of the day, you're learning. And I think if you get up in the morning, you say Birkas Torah, and that's the only thing you do, I think you won't carry the mitzvah of Limud Torah. Even though you can argue that for sure that the maskana isn't Oskahalten, it's not Mochrach. But so that to me was something I always wanted. I always wanted a sefer. And I've looked at the Hafla, and honestly, I've been looking at the Hafla the last few weeks, and I'm looking at this sefer, and I think our mechaber is a very good writer. I'm not going to say better, but I think he's a great writer. And what you have in your hand then is a sefer that if you're a Talmid Chacham who wants to know what it is that the Brisker Derech was coming to supplant, or what was Gemara learning like from 1700 to 1900, before the Olam HaYeshivas came into being and kind of took over. You have something now in your hand that you can be, but the mechaber whose style of writing is it's easy to understand, and you'll see how he builds the arguments and how he sets up this whole kind of pilpul for you. So in a way, my father gave me something that I always wanted with this Ksav Yad.
You mentioned the Darish L'Tzion of the Neder Yehuda by Al Kugam. So a good place for those interested in hearing more, a lot more to talk about Pilpul, is Rabbi Dr. David Katz, who has a podcast. His dissertation on the Neder Yehuda, he has a really fabulous overview of Pilpul, and he talks a lot about this for those interested.
That's me. I really appreciate that.
I can send you a PDF of it, and people can ask me. And so he's fantastic. Recommend his podcast, of course. And but he just goes through Pilpul very much in his dissertation. So the style of the sefer, then, as you mentioned, is really a Pilpul style. So listeners shouldn't expect, if they're interested in Masechta Gittin coming up at the they shouldn't expect they're going to find something here small and gefes, some little ha'ara. Is it more maracha? Is it more like he has maracha? So what's the style, just in general, like lengthwise of the pieces? Is it only Pilpul? Is there ever like ha'aras? Diukim, or not really?
Good question. Okay, so I would say that 85% of the 900 pages are chidushim that take about 1.5 pages or 2 pages each. Basically, starting with a kasha from Tosus or from a Rishon or something like that. Well, I'd say 1 to 4 pages of chidushim. By the way, he has a lot on the Agadata too, which is also interesting. So you don't, and he'll take it apart in a pilpulistic way. So you have Pilpul on Agadata. He doesn't skip the Agadata. And then Psachim and even the Skittin, on the 5th parak, you'll find stuff for him to say. And in Bab Metzia, there's also a guy that pay dollar around there, and you'll find him talking there too. So his typical comment is he's marich. It's at least 25 lines, and it could be 1 to 4 pages. And that's, as I said, about 85% of the sefer. Mixed in with that, he has 2 other kinds of additions. One addition is he's got drushes that he gave. Like you can imagine that the Shabbos Agalo drushes, some of the Shabbos Agalo drushes show up in Psachim. He even tells you the date that he gave it and the place, because I said he wasn't only in Kasha for a while. He was in this town in Poland called Zoleshitz, and so he says, this is the Shabbos Agalo drush I gave in Zoleshitz. If it's no get to that daf, so that'll be a 3, 4, 5, 6 page, again, Pilpul. And then what I find really fascinating, and I'm sorry I should have, in the table of contents, I should have set these apart. Again, I'll say to Radaf, he will give a 10-page essay on a topic that's that shows up in the Masechta. So I give you, and there are about, I'd say about 9, 10 of those throughout the Sefer. And as I said, they go on for 10, 15 pages here's examples I made. Min B'mino, which comes up in Psachim, right? So he's got 10 pages, and that's a great workout if you're, learning taruvas, and just again, it's not the style of learning, but you'll test your skill as a learner to go through it. Mariko Shtifa, again from Psachim. Shema Yechape, which is obviously from Gittin. He has a whole essay on Shema Yechape. Let's see. Hamatame v'amadamea v'amanase. That's, to me, is very interesting. He got Brisker stuff. He's got some Kachim stuff in the fifth parak of Gittin. And Kohanim Shepiglu v'amikdash. So in each of those, and there are about 4 or 5 others, he has these essays where he'll give you his, well-crafted analysis of the issue. And so you can actually learn those independently. And you can just take one of those and say, you know what, I'm going to master one pilpulistic essay and go through that. This sefer basically is not for the faint of heart. I think it's for somebody who's learning full time and is not in a kollel where they require him to learn particular things. And so he has the, hachavas hadas to learn and to become more broad-minded in his learning. Or somebody like my age, is getting, a little closer to retirement and had a good Jewish education. And Mitzvah will have time to sit and hurry in this. And, with a few days' work, you can go through one of these essays and come out really as a knowledgeable in the topic. You're looking for one of the essays?
And what you see is interesting is that he has, like you said, he has an Agarata as well, which is very interesting. And now something else about the Sefer, like you mentioned, it's 900 pages, Psachim, Gittin, and Bamitzia, not all, and not complete. Some of the sectors we were missing a little, right? I think Psachim starts in the second parak.
Right. But besides Psachim, which is missing the first parak and a bit of the second parak, the other ones, we have almost the entire thing. Like the first page, probably the Ksav Yad, which is different colors. It must have been sewn together at some point. And probably the first and last page, the last page of the other 2 Masechtas got lost. But we have like 99% of Bava Metzia and 99% of Gittin. So, I must say the Rabbi Heller, Moshe Heller himself is a mechaber. He wrote a sefer on Taros called Be'er Miriam, and he edited dozens of these Hungarian svarim. He did a great job. He didn't overload you with Marmakoma. So when I say 900 pages, you can, like I said, I'd say 95% of it is the Divrei HaMechaber himself.
Yeah, and you have light horrors. There are horrors on here, but it's mainly they're not long, extensive ones. Generally, they try to just stay to basics, being mitzvah, to yunim, or what we would call, but there are horrors as well, but the lighter ones. So, okay, and I'll try to find the link, and any interested listeners can purchase it. It should be available in General Farm Store as well, I will mention.
That's a good question, actually. I would say this. For anybody listening in Israel, it's obviously available to the Machon Shlomo Alman. It's on their website. If you're in the U.S., I know that it came to Beagle Eisen, and it's also available in Zundel Berman's farm stores. We only printed 500. And I took for myself about 150, and I know at least 100 have sold already. So there aren't that many. And as I said, if you want to get a collector's item for a status quo Rav Sefer, this is you have to move quickly, because I think I'm going to take a few more for my friends and family before we're done.
Yeah, listen, I know you gave me a copy, so I know you're definitely giving some out. Yeah, I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to say about the Sefer the Mechaber, and then I'll move on to ask you what else, if you're working on anything else.
Yes. And as I said, I think that's it for the Mechaber. I'm sure when we finish, I'm going to kick myself and say, I could have mentioned this, I could have mentioned that. But as I said, the schus to my father, and I guess to me, will be, afilu echad, but hopefully there'll be more than one. If Talmidei Chachamim can take the Sefer and learn from it, and learn what learning was like, and just be mavato everything that they know about learning until now, and just learn as if they were living in the year 1842, and just learn the Pilpul Sefer, and then walk away and say, well, what did I gain from this? And tell me that they really enjoyed, even if they disagree with the pshat, they really enjoyed the workout that it gave them. To just learn what kind of yediyas were out there then, and what kind of machabrim, and just spread Torah that way. I'm hoping, Makidei Shir I have given it to a few Makidei Shir who are in the Inyanim of these Masechtas. and hopefully, for them it'll be easier to read through. So the more it can get out there through these select readers, I think the more hana I will have, and the more schus it will be for my father and for his neshama. So yes, I want to mention one more thing that I can't stop now that I got into this world. It's not a world I would ever want to leave. And the next project I have is my father's uncle. As I said, my father's brother, whose name was Tzvi Hirsch Friedman, was a Talmud and a Ben Bayis of the Kedushas Yontif, who was the father of Rabbi Yoelish, the Satmar Rebbe that we know most about. So he lived in the house in Siget. Rabbi Yoelish's father, Rabbi Yoelish himself, grew up in Siget. Remember where they had to escape from El. So Rabbi Yoelish and Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch were really chaverim. He was a little older than Rabbi Yoelish, and we'll come to that in a minute. So he, after he got married, he was a rav in a town in Transylvania, a Hungarian-speaking town called Hatzag, for about 5-6 years, and for reasons that we do not know, he moved to the United States in 1922. He was one of the first, maybe the first Rav in America who wore white socks and the shtreimel, and it was a real Talmid Chacham, and he got into tremendous fights. With the Litvish Rabbanim that were here at the time, and he printed all kinds of kuntusim and starim against them. They're almost all called Tzvi Chamed. I've spent a lot of my adult life trying to assemble anything I can that was printed by him and letters. And I know every year or so, somebody from the Satmar community calls me and says they're doing research on the Satmar Rebbe and they want to talk to me about Tzvi Hirsch, because he was one of the few people in America who knew the Satmar Rebbe as a youngster, and was grew up in his house and knew him from the Haim, and wasn't necessarily mirtos. He didn't have the emes hadin from the Satmar Rebbe that other people had, and he would sometimes get into arguments with the Satmar Rebbe, which I don't know much about, but I know they existed. So I know there's the letters from the Satmar Rebbe to him. He was more machmir than the Satmar Rebbe about Sefer Kochavim. And the Satmar Rebbe wrote to him and said, "I know you're right, but we can't do this." So Satmar Rebbe is almost like a monotext Rabbi. We can't get the Olam to do this, so let's just go with this shita. Let's not be machmir even more. So that the Satmar have published, and that put him on the radar screen for Satmar. But as I said, he fought with a lot of Rabbanim from 1924 till he stopped till the late 60s. He died in 1970. He was a very strange character. My father only met him twice. He didn't want to have anything to do with the family. In the later years, my father being the Ish Shalom, he really was a Friedman. He was able to get him to make peace with us, and we went to his house in Flatbush once. He came to our house in Queens once. Anyway, he has these svarim that are fascinating. They're sometimes paragraph by paragraph rebuttals of literature Rabbanim svarim. I'll give you the first one for an example. There was a sefer called Kolcha de Hetera, which is written by a very interesting person. He had smicha from the Beis Halevi, and he had a medical degree. He didn't have too many people like that in the late 1800s. He went to Zichron Yaakov, where he was the doctor, and he wouldn't treat the colonists if they weren't wearing tzitzis. This Rav. So eventually they kicked him out of Zichron Yaakov. He went to America, and he was a Rav in Crown Heights. And he had a shul, and he wrote a sefer about Kocha de Teira. It was a man and a woman who got married. The man didn't have what we call Koach Gavra, and the question was, can you say that because of that, there was no Kiddushin? Obviously, he disappeared, and the woman wanted to remarry. And this Kocha de Teira sefer paskin that the woman could get remarried because there was a mekach, there wasn't really a Kiddushin. So my father's uncle, wrote a sefer with a rebuttal called Koach HaTorah, which is a doctor, Kocha de Teira, play on his words. And then there was another sefer, Hashavas Lekachos. He wrote a sefer called Hashavas kehilla against it. He wrote about Esrogim from Eretz Yisrael and Murkav. He wrote about the Haida Mechitzas. He also wrote svarim against Moshe Feinstein. There was a big fight about artificial insemination in the 60s, in the mid-60s, which I'm sure you know about. So he wrote 3 kuntusim against that. So my idea would be to republish all the svarim, maybe with a historical akdama, and to have maybe Rabbi Heller could do lamdish, Mar Mekomos on the Svarim. Not that there's not a lot of lamdish in the Svarim to begin with, but it helps to get more of a perspective, because he doesn't quote sources that are not for him. and then maybe publish also the Svarim that he wrote against as one sefer. Because if you don't have the sefer that he's attacking, you don't really get the full picture. So that would be, I think, a very interesting thing for as a hobby. It's an interesting thing for a Talmud Chacham to read, because here's a guy, who clearly likes to pick fights, but he's no Amaret. And just to run through the issues and see, and also to learn about how orthodox he was in America at the time. So I have a couple of second cousins, grandchildren of his, who are interested in that. And now that I put this project behind me, if any of your listeners are interested in this and want to write the Hakdama or are interested in Marmakomos, they can contact me. You can put out my email address. I'd be very interested in that. If we could ever publish the Pnei Avraham again, I would also be interested in somebody writing. This is what I really wanted. I couldn't find somebody to write a Lamdash Hakdama about the differences between the Briska Derech and the Pilpul Derech that's in the Sefer, because I think that would be a great reading for today's Talmud Chacham.
Absolutely. Okay, I'll put your email in the show's notes. Those interested in contacting you, and people could ask me for it as well. I'll try to find a link for those in America to purchase the Sefer Pnei Avraham. And yeah, you didn't mention about Pnei Avraham on Chulin or Paris Office, I think it's called, right? It's stuff. Those farm are not redone either.
They are, yes, they are available through Goldenberg or as reprints. In fact, the Rabbi Heller, who I met obviously a few times in the course of this, he said, "Why don't you put out the Sichas, the Pnei Avraham Masechas Chulin? There's mistakes there too. You could do it as one said." I said, really, it's my father's thing. He's not my great grandfather. I would like to do it, but I have budget. I'd rather get my uncle. I said, I heard your Sichas Chulin. I said to him, but I'd rather get my uncle's stuff going with my limited means. But I think you're right. I think my greatest dream would be that the Pilpul alumnus will get a renaissance here, and that there'll be these kind of machons that reissue the Or Chadash will reissue the Pnei Avraham and Anchulin and other lamdish svarim that are not necessarily politically correct, because I think the more we have out there, the better Torah is going to be.
Absolutely. Okay, well, thank you very much for joining me to talk about, I would say, the Pnei Avraham, but like I said in the beginning, but it's not only that. It was about your father's story and the Pilpul and the Pnei Avraham, and at the end, your uncle. So a lot of fascinating information here in the episode, and I hope the listeners enjoyed as much as I did, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you for all you do, Kol Tov.